All right, next game on Friday afternoon was down at the Morewell Recreation Reserve, and that was Collingwood and Hawthorne. We've got Josh Gabelich back with us. Hey, Josh, how was this game?
Oh, Warnie, what a performance by the Pies. Who would have thought the Craig McRae era gets off to an absolute belting start? I know it's only February, but Collingwood supporters have been absolutely pumped about this, and rightly so.
Well, they pumped a pretty decent score. Was that a highlight of their game, that they found the avenues to score?
They found plenty of avenues to score. That was the thing. And no Jordan De Goey, don't forget that. He's still got the ribs issue, and he seems like more likely than not to play next week against GWS. But Jamie Elliott kicked 5 in the first. Well, they played 6 terms. So it's a bit of a more, when you think about all these games that have been played across this weekend, this one's a bit harder to read because they played 6 terms of 30 minutes. And after the third term, most of the senior players went off the ground, and the younger, the reserves came on with a lot of VFL listed players. So it's difficult to read anything beyond the end of the third term. But in the first 2 terms, Jamie Elliott kicked 5 goals, and he was absolutely sensational. He probably could have kicked a couple more.
And the thing was, he was doing a bit of run through the midfield doing that as well.
He was, yeah. He played quite high through the ground, especially in that third term when he'd already had 5 on the board. He dished off a couple. So he was super impressive. Mason Cox kicked 3 goals as well. He had a lick of the ice cream. So did Jack Ginnivan. He was really impressive. Brody Mychek kicked 3. So it was a real shellacking when you think about it. It is only February, but it was a performance that was very exciting for Collingwood supporters.
Nice. All right, let's have a talk about some of these players that are on the lips of fantasy players, and that is, let's start, Nick Dacos, most popular player in Fantasy Classic because we like his chops as a kid with his fantasy scoring. What's it going to be like at the big level, and we're going to see him in round 1?
Collingwood fans have been thinking about Nick Dacos for, I'd say, 3 or 4 years. I can't remember a father-son prospect who's been talked about for this long. When Josh Dacos was drafted, there was always the talk about just wait for his brother. There's a fair gap between those two. I think it's 4 or 5 years. So we've been thinking about Nick Dacos as a football community for a long, long time. And it was almost a moment of pure poetry. Josh Dacos dished off to Nick Dacos for his first goal in the black and white. Yes, it's a pre-season game, but it was a pure moment. And both Dacos has played really well, to be fair. But Nick Dacos in particular showed some glimpses of why he's going to be a rising star contender this year. So
his role's going to be quite interesting because he'll be there round 1, and there was a talk of the half-back, but if he's getting up the ground and kicking goals as well, we're just going to see him as an all-over-the-ground type player.
I think we are. I think we'll see him a little bit of everywhere. I think probably a little bit forward because he is a young player. We can't forget that these guys have missed so much football. I'm talking about the Victorian draftees. I think Nick Dacos has only played about 10 games in the past 2 years due to the pandemic, and we spoke about Jason Horne-Francis after Thursday's game, and I think he played 24 games last year. So there's a real significance in terms of the difference in how much football they've played. But Nick Dacos is pure class.
All right, also a new player at the Pies, but he's had a little bit of experience, is Patrick Lepinsky. Now, he did find himself in the midfield a lot, and that was the opportunity that he's sort of been wanting and possibly part of the reason why he left the Bulldogs. So what did you think of his match?
Warning, the Pies gave up pick 43 to Patrick Lepinsky. And I think by the end of the year, we'll be talking about that as the best value trade from last October's exchange period. I think Patrick Lepinsky could be a real star this year. Starved of opportunity at the Western Bulldogs, and he wanted midfield time. He didn't want to get stuck on a wing, which was the only way he was going to get games in 2022. And he played throughout the midfield in Morewell. He had 19 touches, the most on the ground when the good players came off at the end of the third term. So he had a really impressive start, and he's had a pretty good pre-season. So I really look forward to seeing how he goes next week against the Giants ahead of round 1. But he's definitely one to keep an eye on.
Good value too in fantasy, especially in draft, because I think a lot of people might forget about him. And if he is going to be getting midfield clock, and that's one of the things that we do love with fantasy footy is role and looking at what they're doing. And other players getting midfield time as well. Jack Crisp. Now, he's got his defender status because that's predominantly what he plays. So he spent a fair bit of time on the ball as well.
He spent the whole time in the midfield. And I think this is a sign of what's to come under Craig McRae. We know Jack Crisp is a star across halfback. Crisp has been a star for a long time. Copeland Trophy winner last year. I think he's played 163 games in a row. He's just super durable, doesn't miss. So if he can go in the midfield and give them another option, because they're not quite what they used to be in terms of their midfield depth and quality. Obviously, we've seen Treloar go, Stevenson go. Players like that go, but I reckon Chris is a really good decision maker. He finds so much of the footy. I think we're going to see him chop and change off half-back and through the midfield, just like we're going to see with Scott Pendlebury, potentially even with Braden Maynard this year. They're floating that as well, but Jack Crisp was very impressive through the midfield in Morewell.
Bulk midfield rotation, especially from these defenders, which Pendles was going to call himself that. Saw him taking kick-ins. He will gain defender status by round 6. Would you agree with me on that in fantasy?
I think so. It was. I can't remember the last time I've seen him take a kick in. I'm sure he's taken plenty in his time, but it just felt a little bit different because we know he's going to play at half-back this year, and obviously he's 34. He's a veteran. But he also doesn't miss, a bit like Jack Crisp. I think he's averaged over 20 games a season throughout his whole career. He doesn't miss much football. He's obviously the games record holder at Collingwood. He signed that 2-year deal in late August, so he's got a bit more football left in him. Could even get to 400. Who knows with someone like him? But I think we're going to see him find so much of the footy behind the ball this year.
All right, well, I think Pies fans will be up and about and very excited with that. We better talk about some Hawthorn action. And, well, they were beaten, but what did you learn from these guys?
Well, one thing I did learn, and to be honest, from a Hawthorn perspective, today was really, a big part of it was about James Sicily. Mm-hmm. Now, he hasn't played a game since round 12, 2020. It's 18 months. It's such a long time for an ACL. We don't usually see it. But I think when you really break down the timing of things, he could have got back for the last 2, maybe 3 games last year, and they just didn't think it was worth the risk. So it's not like he's had setbacks, but he came back against the Pies, and he looked like he hadn't missed much footy. It was quite remarkable how well he started the game. He had a couple of moments that were very James Sicily, gave away a 50-metre penalty instead of the goal to Jamie Elliott for umpire dissent. But I kind of like the way he goes about it. I love that white line fever, but they'd be rapt to have him through game 1. He'll play again in the Amy game against Richmond down in Devonport. So I think he's absolutely raring to go. Jack Gunston got through a game as well. He only played the 1 game last year. So they had those 2 really key players, 2 super important players. When you think about the demographic of this list, it's quite young, very young, in fact. So to get those 2 players back at each end of the ground was pretty significant. But in terms of what we learned, I think there's a couple of midfielders there at Hawthorn that are still, they're not Tom Mitchell, they're not Jager O'Meara, so they're not A-grade level, but I'm talking about Jai Newcomb, who we saw come in last year, mid-season draft. He only played 7 games in the back end of the year coming from Box Hill, but he looks like he's gone to another level. And I've watched a lot of matches him out at Waverley Park this summer, and he's been really, really noticeable. And he was pretty impressive against the Magpies. And the other one is James Walpole. We go back to 2019, the year that Tom Mitchell missed with that broken leg, and Walpole won the Crewman's Medal. It was quite remarkable what he did. We don't know how they fit in the same midfield. We haven't seen them click. I don't think we've seen them click properly just yet, but maybe this is the year we see them click.
Well, Walpole's an interesting one because he's a one for fantasy draft that you could be really looking at. He had a down season last year, so he's sort of down the order when you're looking at players by average, and can he get it back up into those 90s with those guys working well together? So we'll be keeping a good eye on him in the Amy game as well. Any of the kids sort of stand out or get much from them? Like Josh Ward is obviously one that was a high draft pick that the Hawks supporters will be hoping they'll get to see at some point. How did he look?
He's the one, Warnie. Josh Ward was very, very impressive, actually. He was one of the few positives. Aside from Sicily getting through, I'd say Josh Ward was the next big positive for them. There's so much interest in him, given where he was taken in the draft at pick 7. He's had a really strong pre-season. He's such a good runner. So we've heard about him a lot in the pre-season. And unfortunately with the pre-season, it's a lot about your athletic exploits. But he found plenty of the ball. He looks like quite a player. And I'm sure, given where they're at right now, they're a bottom 4 side. I think right now, I don't know if they'll finish in the bottom 4 this year, but I think right now they are. He's going to get lots of football. So is Connor McDonald. Like they're 2 players that were taken quite high in the draft. But Josh Ward's definitely one that I think will play plenty of footy this year.
Well, we'll be keeping an eye on him being a round one because we all need our cash cows there. So let's hope that he can make it through. Just quickly before we finish this one up, the rucks, Ned Reeves probably he spent the most of the time in the ruck by the looks of it. What do you reckon they'll be doing? Will they be going a bit of McAvoy with Reeves, or how do you see that playing out?
That's the feel at the moment. Obviously, Max Lynch came across from Collingwood, and Reeves and Lynch have gone head-to-head all summer. I've watched quite a bit of their match team and some of their inter-clubs, and they've been quite ferocious. It's been clearly, I mean, you see it when they're rucks, because it's a clear one-on-one the whole time. So it's not hard to miss, but it's been ferocious between those two, and it's been pretty tight. But I think Reeves clearly looks like he's got the lead right now. McAvoy didn't go in the ruck too much. I mean, we know he can do that. He's done it for a very long time, but they're toying with whether to play him in attack. Even this year, he can go behind the footy. We know that. But I think it's going to be a Reeves-McAvoy combination to start the year. But don't rule out Max Lynch. He's a ferocious competitor, but they've spent a lot of time developing Ned Reeves, and I reckon he's going to come along a bit more this year.
Beauty. Well, thanks, Josh, for your time today. And, lots of footy for you to watch and plenty for you to take out of it as you start building your fantasy team for this year.
Pleasure, Warnie. Look forward to chatting again soon.